Today's lecture deals specifically with the mechanism known as photosynthesis. In our previous lecture, we discussed cellular respiration, which was an energy conversion process that allowed for ATP production via the breakdown of glucose. Today, we're going to transition into a different energy conversion mechanism, again known as photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is a process that captures light energy and converts it into chemical energy. But before we can do that, I want to talk about two basic concepts that deal with how organisms acquire compounds for energy. Organisms can be considered autotrophs, and autotrophs are self-feeding. They are the producers in the global ecosystem. They are not totally self-sufficient, but can sustain life without eating other organisms. There are two broad categories of autotrophs. There are those that are called photoautotrophs that utilize light and convert that light into a usable source of energy. The other category is something known as a chemoautotroph. This is an autotroph that obtains energy by oxidizing inorganic compounds, such as sulfur and ammonia. So if an organism is not considered an autotroph, it is typically referred to as a heterotroph, which literally translates to other feeders. This is an organism that cannot make its own organic molecules from inorganic ones. They are unable to make their own food, essentially. They are other feeding, and they are the consumers in the global ecosystem. So we can take a quick look at the flow of energy and chemical cycling that occurs in what we refer to as the biosphere. On the left-hand side of the slide, you can see the mechanisms that we discussed, referred to as cellular respiration. And to review again, cellular respiration was an energy conversion mechanism that was able to harness the energy associated with glucose in the presence of oxygen to then produce ATP that is needed for the cell to do different types of work. Cellular respiration, however, does produce carbon dioxide and water. It turns out that photosynthesis is able to utilize carbon dioxide and water to harness the energy associated with light to then convert that into a fuel source that can be then used or utilized by an organism that requires it. And what you see here is a cyclic process that occurs between photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So photosynthesis, again, is an energy conversion process where light energy is captured and converted into chemical energy. It is a mechanism that is utilized by plants. However, there are other organisms that can participate in photosynthesis as well. There are some examples of protists as well as bacteria, and we'll look at some examples on the next slide as well. Also, on this particular slide, you see the chemical summary equation of what is occurring during photosynthesis. In summary, carbon dioxide is utilized, specifically the carbon is captured from carbon dioxide along with water to then harness the energy associated with light in the process of photosynthesis to produce glucose and oxygen. And this slide too just highlights organisms in general that are able to photosynthesize. Plants, again, are the number one photosynthetic producer. However, there are photosynthetic protists as well as photosynthetic bacteria. Since plants are the typical organism that we focus on when discussing or dealing with photosynthesis, I want to spend a little time looking at the components that are involved in the photosynthetic process. On this slide, up at the top, you see in the far left-hand corner of the figure, a typical leaf from a plant. When you look at a typical leaf from a plant, you can look at the layers of the cells that are found, and Within the layers of the cells, you find the section that is known as the mesophyll. Now, the mesophyll is the location where most of photosynthesis does in fact take place. On the underside of a typical leaf, there are specialized structures known as stomata, and stomata are also referred to as guard cells. These guard cells open and close and allow for gas exchange to occur. Since carbon dioxide is required for photosynthesis, this is where the carbon dioxide will actually enter into the leaf and eventually diffuse into the mesophyll. And this is also where oxygen that is produced by photosynthesis is released from the plant. Now, the organelle that is involved in photosynthesis is known as the chloroplast. And the chloroplast we discussed really briefly when we looked at different cell organelles. If we review the basic structure of a typical chloroplast, a chloroplast also has a double membrane system, an outer membrane and an inner membrane. But more importantly, inside the chloroplast, there is another membrane structure that is composed of what is known as thylakoids. Thylakoids are basically small disc-like structures that are stacked one on top of the other. An entire stack of thylakoids is called a granum, and that plural is grana. In addition to the grana, you have what's known as the stroma, and the stroma is the semi-fluid portion that fills the rest of the space of the chloroplast. Now, each one of these components will become important as we begin to discuss photosynthesis in more detail, because photosynthesis is divided into metabolic stages that occurs in different locations within the chloroplast. Just like we discussed with cellular respiration, I oftentimes like to talk about a summary of the process that is going on. So on this particular slide is a summary that is taking place of the photosynthetic process. First of all, photosynthesis is divided into two stages, or two metabolic phases. There are what are known as the light reactions, and there is what is known as the Calvin cycle. The light reactions occur within the thylakoids, specifically membrane-associated proteins within the thylakoids, and this is the part, like you see in the diagram, where light comes in and the energy is extracted from light in order to convert it into a usable form or source for the organism in question. It is the photo part of photosynthesis. Again, light energy here is converted into chemical energy. It is also a series of electron transfer reactions, so those redox reactions that we discussed with cellular respiration, and understanding them will be important in understanding the light reactions of photosynthesis. There is also an activated carrier that is playing a role in these redox reactions. In this case, the activated carrier is a molecule known as NADP, but acts just like NAD does in that it can pick up electrons and transfer them to reactions that require them. Water is also split or broken apart in the light reactions. Oxygen is a byproduct of the light reactions. And in addition, there is a small amount of ATP that is produced by a process known as photophosphorylation. Now, this ATP is not for general use, like the ATP that's produced in cellular respiration. It is ATP that is produced and feeds into the Calvin cycle. The second metabolic stage is in fact the Calvin cycle, and this is the synthesis part of photosynthesis. This is where a process known as carbon fixation occurs. Carbon dioxide is required, and it is the carbon from the carbon dioxide that will eventually be incorporated into an organic molecule, hence the term carbon fixation. Now, it's important to understand that light is in fact a form of energy. It travels in waves, similar to dropping a pebble in water. However, it is again considered a form of energy. There are pigment molecules that are found embedded in the thylakoid membrane that have the ability to harness the energy associated with light. The number one pigment molecule, like you see in this figure here, is known as chlorophyll. However, there are other pigment molecules that have the ability to harness the energy associated with light as well. Now, pigments are in fact molecules that have the ability to absorb different wavelengths of light. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the number one pigment in playing a role in photosynthesis is a molecule known as chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is actually found in two distinct forms: chlorophyll A, which happens to absorb blue, violet, and red light, and chlorophyll B, which happens to absorb blue and orange light. So it turns out that chlorophyll actually reflects back the green wavelength of light, and this is why chlorophyll, plant leaves, plants in general, have that green appearance to them. The green wavelength of light is actually not being absorbed by the pigments and is being reflected back at us, and that's why they look green. Now, there are also a number of other pigments that have the ability to absorb light. In particular, there are pigments known as carotenoids as well as xanthophylls, and again, these have the ability to absorb different wavelengths of light to play a role in harnessing energy. Throughout the membrane of the thylakoid, you find clusters of pigments or organization of pigment molecules that are referred to as a photosystem. What you see in this figure on the right-hand side is a cluster of pigment molecules in a photosystem. In general, what happens is the energy associated with light comes in and begins to excite an electron to a higher level of energy. That electron is actually bounced around from pigment molecule to pigment molecule until it hits a specific pigment molecule known as the reaction center chlorophyll, and that's in the center of this figure in the darker color overall. The reaction center chlorophyll is a special chlorophyll because it is also linked to an additional molecule known as the primary electron acceptor. The excited electron, once it hits the reaction center chlorophyll, will then be transferred to the primary electron acceptor, and that excited electron is then transferred to a different series of reactions. So in general, again, we have this photosystem that's found in multiple locations throughout the thylakoid membrane, and this is where the energy is harnessed from light. The energy excites an electron and eventually gets captured by the primary electron acceptor. This figure just puts a little more structural organization in with the light reactions. Those reactions that we just discussed on the previous slide are what's happening in this particular slide as well. However, you see those components of each electron transport chain embedded in the membrane of the thylakoid. So again, just trying to give you some frame of reference as to the location of all of these reactions. What is happening, though, in this process, again, is similar to cellular respiration in that we are generating a concentration gradient of hydrogen ions. This time it is occurring within the thylakoid space. With that high concentration of hydrogen ions or protons, we can then harness that energy through a molecule known as ATP synthase to synthesize ATP. Now, this ATP synthase is not the exact same ATP synthase from cellular respiration. It is, in fact, a distinct molecule, but its function is essentially the same to allow for the production of ATP. So specifically, in the light reactions, energy that is associated with light has been harnessed and converted into both ATP and NADPH. Both of those molecules have a great deal of energy associated with them. Again, that energy that was associated with light in this energy conversion process. The second metabolic stage is known as the Calvin cycle, also referred to as carbon fixation, and is the synthesis part of photosynthesis. It is a cyclic process, and it occurs within the stroma of the chloroplast. In this process, carbohydrates are produced or synthesized from the carbon of carbon dioxide. So again, this is referred to as carbon fixation. It is the carbon in the carbon dioxide that enters this particular stage and will eventually leave as a sugar in this process. So I want you to think back for a minute on cellular respiration, in that cellular respiration took a fuel source, such as glucose, and broke it down to convert the energy that was stored in glucose into a usable form inside of the cell. That means that glucose has a great deal of energy stored within the molecule. If the goal here for Calvin cycle is to synthesize a carbohydrate, such as glucose, there will need to be a great deal of energy input into the reaction in order for that process to take place. This is in fact a cycle, and obviously not every single step of the cycle is in this summary slide. What I do want you to understand with this process is that you have 3 carbon dioxides coming in. There is the requirement for a great deal of ATP. Specifically, 9 ATP are utilized in order to result in the synthesis of a 3-carbon sugar, as well as the energy associated with NADPH. So again, to synthesize a very simple 3-carbon molecule, there is going to be a great deal of energy that needs to be input in this system. The ATP that feeds the Calvin cycle is specifically generated by the light reactions we just talked about. And again, those ATPs from the light reaction do not go for general cellular use. They are utilized specifically by the Calvin cycle. So let's summarize these processes once again. Photosynthesis is a mechanism or a process that harnesses the light associated with energy in order to produce a fuel source that can be then utilized by the cell in processes like cellular respiration. Focusing on photosynthesis, there are 2 distinct stages or phases. There are the light reactions that occur within the thylakoid, specifically the thylakoid membrane of the chloroplast. This is specifically where the energy associated with light is captured, and that energy is converted into the form of energy known as ATP and NADPH. Water is required for the light reactions, and oxygen is produced. The ATP and the NADPH from the light reactions directly go to fuel the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle is the second metabolic stage. This is where carbon fixation takes place. The carbon from carbon dioxide is harnessed and eventually converted into a 3-carbon sugar. That 3-carbon sugar will eventually be converted into other carbohydrates that the cell can utilize.